My question has to do with Sri Lanka and the recently concluded war there. In light of all the humanitarian and human rights abuses by the government of Sri Lanka and the inability of the West, namely the EU and the US, to influence that either at the UN Human Rights Council or in calls for better humanitarian access, how does he see that playing with the role of China, India, Iran, and Pakistan's influence in that area, as it's the 80% of China's oil comes from the Middle East through past Sri Lanka? Thank you.
Sri Lanka. Well, it's been a horror story, especially towards the end. And it illustrates a number of things. For example, it illustrates just what is meant by responsibility to protect. A lot of noble rhetoric about responsibility to protect, but there was no particular Western advantage in protecting people who are being slaughtered and driven into concentration camps, so somehow that didn't make it in the noble rhetoric. I happened to be giving a talk about this at the General Assembly last summer, and the hypocrisy was so profound, it was suffocating. I mean, no protection for people who it doesn't do us any good to protect, basically. And Sri Lankans have that unfortunate position. What about China? They don't gain anything by supporting Tamil refugees in concentration camps, so why should they do it? In fact, most of the South supported the Sri Lankan government, as I'm sure you know. That's who they are. They are the elites of their countries. They support the elites of other countries in the South. Happens all the time. It's important. I mean, there's another talk that I was kind of thinking of giving, but didn't, but I would like to someday, which has to do with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which can be looked at quite a different way. Berlin Wall fell on November 9th. Huge celebration in the West right now. All kind of self-congratulation about how marvelous it was. And yeah, it was good that the Russian dictatorship collapsed and that Eastern Europeans had a breath of freedom. But other things were happening at the same time. So for example, a couple of days later, on November 16th, there was a real termination of the drive to break out of the neo-colonial order that began in the 50s and looked kind of promising in the 60s, but was viciously beaten back by the Western powers. And it had many aspects, one of them being liberation theology, which was totally smashed by US violence and Vatican cooperation with the help of the Western powers. And the last sort of whisper of it was on November 16th, 1989, so also 20 years ago, namely the brutal assassination of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests in El Salvador, which kind of framed the decade of the 80s. Began with the assassination of an archbishop, a voice for the voiceless, reading Mass, ended with the murder of the 6 Jesuit intellectuals by elite forces armed and trained by the United States, which had already killed thousands, if not tens of thousands of the usual victims, peasants and so on. This all kind of passed without a whisper in the West. I mean, if that had happened in Czechoslovakia, we'd probably had a nuclear war. But it happened in El Salvador, these kind of insignificant people, and it was a kind of and not just El Salvador, it was even worse in Guatemala, I mentioned. And in fact, goes on, like about probably 1 million or more people were killed in the neighborhood of South Africa, Mozambique and Angola, thanks in no small measure to Reagan's support for his friends in South Africa. And of course, defense of South Africa against one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world, as Washington declared it in 1988, namely the African National Congress. You may be relieved to know that Mandela was finally removed from the terrorist list a couple of months ago. So all of this was going on, and it was kind of the terminus of a major attack against the South, which did destroy the hopes in the early 60s for a new world that would pay attention to things like racism, inequality, justice, and so on. That was beaten back in many dimensions. And November 16th was a kind of a symbolic end to it, but that's not going to be commemorated. Actually, I have in my office at MIT a painting that was given to me by a Jesuit priest, which is a kind of artistic depiction of the assassination of the 6 Jesuit intellectuals. It's a picture of the angel of death, and standing under him is, kind of a caricature of the Archbishop Romero, then the 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and their daughter. And I put it there sort of to remind myself of the real world, but it also has served another purpose in the last 15 or so years. It's kind of a Rorschach. From the United States, nobody has a clue what it is. From Europe, maybe 10% know what it is. From Latin America, up until recently, everybody knew what it is. And now that's declining as the brainwashing and indoctrination begins to set in among the young. Just suppose that had happened in Czechoslovakia, let's say. As I said, everybody would know, and we'd probably have had nuclear war. But not here. These are our atrocities and the culmination of massive atrocities going way back. Well, that's maybe a little off the mark of the question, but that's an alternative talk that somebody ought to give, or a book that they ought to write. Or there's a couple of dissertations for you. It's a major topic. That's what we ought to be talking about this November. You can guess how much discussion there's going to be about it, or for that matter, how much discussion there'll be about the way the Bush administration reacted to the fall of the wall. It's barely been discussed, technical literature that's mention of it, but hasn't been an issue, despite the fact that it's very illuminating. This goes to one of these questions about what do you do about unpublicized crises. It said small unpublicized crises. They're not so small. And what you do is try to break through the silence. The silence is almost kind of like an institutional requirement of the educated sectors of the population. That's what intellectuals are for, historically, all the way back. Mainstream of intellectuals very typically have been, flatterers to court. Some dissidents around the fringe are usually treated pretty badly. If they're in Czechoslovakia, maybe go to prison for a while. If they're in El Salvador, they get their brains blown out. Depends on the country that's administering it. But that's pretty much their role, and you have to break through that. I'll come back to that. Actually, a comment on the next question, what can you do about unpublicized crises? Break through the silence. And that takes work, but it can be done.